This next session's about some of the doing things that goes on in livestock, and Sinead sort of touched on it. Vaccination's something that's a regular feature of the calendar. And look, as advisors, I think it's imperative that we understand how these products work. So particularly when a client's asking about a situation that's a little bit different to what normally pops up, we've got a bit of background to look at that situation and say, well, does it change my normal advice, or is there some nuance I need to factor into the advice I'm giving? So Bruce is a vet. He's at Charles Sturt University. He's had 20 years sort of commercial experience in the veterinary consultancy sphere. So Bruce is very well qualified to talk to this issue. And what we've asked Bruce to talk about is vaccinations, but firstly to tell us how they work, and then talk about the decisions around what makes up an appropriate vaccination program. So, Bruce, thank you for being online, and over to you.
Thanks, Ashley, and my apologies, I'm online. Particularly, I think it looked like a sunny day with you guys there. It's 15 degrees maximum here today, and it's about 11 in the office at the moment, and it's raining. So spring is having trouble to break through here, but I'm sure it will shortly. So as Ashley said, I'm going to talk to you on vaccination. I may have, in inverted commas, met some of you last year. I gave a presentation on pain relief, and I'm happy to talk on any issues when we get to the questions. And I'm going to just work out how the slides are working. So probably one of the things is the federal government. I know you guys just love the federal government. The federal government has done a lot of the hard work for me today, because if nothing else, you can go through COVID vaccination here because it's all very similar. So we will be talking about vaccination in sheep and cattle, not COVID vaccination, but I will make just a couple of analogies there because I think it's useful. Joe and Ashley are worried that you're all going to fall asleep for this presentation. So in expectation that that might happen, I'm putting up the key messages at the beginning, and I'll put them up at the end, and you can see that we've covered all of these. But the simple message is that vaccinations are cheap and generally effective means of preventing disease. So they do cost money, and you have to watch cost, but relative to disease, they're very cheap. How well a vaccine works or their efficacies actually depends on the challenge. Everyone always asks, how effective is that vaccine? And you will see all sorts of comments about the COVID vaccines. You know, AstraZeneca's rated at 62 to 83%. Pfizer's rated at 82 to 96%, depending on the situation. In fact, as challenge increases, all vaccines don't perform as well. And as challenge decreases, all vaccines perform better. So there's no such thing as how a vaccine performs. The efficacy of it does vary. Most vaccines require two doses initially with annual boosters. Again, that's most, but not all vaccine. And we'll just touch on which ones are different. Handling vaccines correctly is very important. And if there's one thing that you can all help your producers do, it is absolutely take vaccine with a bit more care than as producers we normally do. Ashley mentioned that I've been in consultancy practice for over 20 years. I also run our own sheep and cattle property at Holbrook. And I know for a fact that when things get busy, I suddenly forget about the vaccine, and it's very easy to mishandle vaccine. And a reminder to producers about how important it is to handle the vaccine is well worthwhile giving to them as often as you can. In terms of whether or not you should be using vaccine, you need to assess what diseases the stock are going to be at risk, and then make sure that you've vaccinated the stock prior to that risk, obviously, if there's a vaccination available. So they're the key messages that we're going to go through. I'm starting the presentation, and hopefully you've got a graph up on your screen at the moment with the very basics of vaccination. And I've just taken this from the Zoetis website, but there's a whole lot of different information sources all give a very similar picture. Initially in animals and in people, in fact, we get protection from maternal antibodies. If that animal has been, if the mother, in this case the ewe or the cow, has either been exposed to the disease or vaccinated, they will pass on maternal antibodies through the colostrum, and that will last for a short period of time. And that will be protective while they're present, but they wane reasonably quickly, probably over 4 to 6 weeks, and certainly by about 10 to 12 weeks, there's little sign of maternal antibodies in most animals. And that's the other thing, certainly we see it in people, but the same occurs in animals. Everyone's response to vaccine is slightly different. So when I give these 4 to 6 weeks or anything, it's probably a range of 2 to 10 weeks. Most are 4 to 6 weeks, but there is quite a range in all of these things. When we give a vaccine, and if it's a 2-dose vaccine, what normally happens is that the first dose does produce effective immunity, but that effective immunity takes a little while to develop and is reasonably short-lived. And it's what happens when you normally get exposed to a disease that you haven't been faced with before. When you get hit with that disease, your defence mechanisms are slow to react, but they do react, and then they give you some immunity. But when you get challenged, or the second vaccine is when you get a much faster and much longer lasting, bigger response. And that's why most vaccines require 2 doses. So in the case of COVID vaccines, one of the really critical things people have been talking about is the timing between the 2 doses. The reason that's important is that if you're faced with disease, and I know you guys aren't over there, and luckily I'm in New South Wales and not Victoria at the moment, but if you're faced with challenge, then that protection only lasts for a short time after the first dose. It's not till you get to the second dose that you get long-lasting protection. So that's the final thing on this slide is that I've mentioned the level of challenge is important. What is protective is that orange line on the graph, but that line goes up and down depending on the level of challenge. And this is why things with COVID, like masks and anything like that decreases the challenge, doesn't give you 100% protection, but minimises the amount of challenge, which means your body's more likely to be able to cope with and respond and not getting as severe as disease. And that's the same with all diseases that I'm aware of. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of how vaccine works. Importantly, why we need a second dose for these vaccines that are 2-dose vaccines, and why 1 dose isn't sufficient for very long. So the labels set the timing between the 2 doses, but importantly, they set the minimum time between 2 doses. So if it says 2 doses 4 weeks apart, then you should wait 4 weeks before giving those 2 doses. Most vaccines that require 2 doses, and the obvious vaccines that don't require 2 doses are Guedere for Johne's, scabby mouth and pink eye. But all the other vaccines, or almost all the other vaccines we're using in sheep and cattle, do require 2 vaccines. They're usually 2 to 6 weeks apart, but each vaccine will have slightly different criteria for that interval, but that's the minimum period. You can leave it much longer between vaccines. That's not a problem for the second vaccine, but what that means is that that gap from that period of the second vaccine to when you give it, the animals are not protected. So if you've invested in one vaccine and then you leave it for 6 months and you give the second vaccine will almost certainly still be effective. You haven't wasted your first dose, but the animal is at risk to that disease from around 4 weeks after the first dose till you give that second dose. What I didn't point out on that first slide was it takes around about 7 to 10 days to mount an immune response following vaccination. So if I get my vaccination today and I get exposed to COVID tomorrow, it didn't matter whether I had the vaccine or not, I'm still fully susceptible. The fortunate thing is when you give the second dose, that response is shortened slightly, and mostly the response will be certainly in sort of 4 to 5 days, possibly even 3 days, up to about a week. So the second dose, you get quite a quick response. The first dose is slightly slower. So the important thing about the gap, and this is a thing we're often asked, is I gave the first dose, I've forgotten to give the second. Can I now give the second, or do I have to start again? No, you can give the second. You got away with it, but just be aware if your policy is to have a big gap, you are leaving animals exposed to the disease. In terms of ongoing boosters, and this is a very interesting debate at the moment in terms of the COVID vaccine, we know for sure that immunity wanes over time. And that varies enormously with the type of disease and the response. And you'll all know that those of you who are my age or older, when we were kids, you had to get tetanus every sort of 2 to 5 years. They then moved it out to 10 years. And now I think it's probably every 15 years they're recommending, because it takes a long while for those antitoxoids to wane from the system, but other ones wane very quickly. And generally speaking, there's mostly a recommendation to do annual boosters, but this is based on relatively little information, and it's assuming that there's no natural challenge to the disease. In actual fact, if for some reason you're under quite a disease challenge and you've had the animals have had effective vaccines, then that ongoing challenge will act as boosters, and you probably don't need a booster. But in the general farm situation where things are pretty well controlled and there's minimal exposure to any diseases, and the exception to this is probably Campylobacter, which I'll mention later on, then annual boosters are probably pretty prudent. I've said for some vaccines it may even need to be more frequent boosters. We're concerned that pulpy kidney under high levels of challenge, such as lush spring conditions or feedlot conditions, you might need a booster every 3 to 6 months. Again, we don't have a lot of data behind us, but that's what the general feeling is. And it obviously depends on the risk and the natural exposure, as I've explained. And what's really interesting in COVID is this whole issue of whether or not we should be giving booster vaccinations to people, to those who have been exposed, to those not who have been exposed, or whether it's more important to get primary vaccination into the rest of the world to stop it mutating. Fortunately, we don't have those issues and we don't have that complication in the sheep and cattle vaccines that we're dealing with. I mentioned in the key messages the importance of handling, and it is something that I regularly see people understand but take no notice, or take less notice than they should of handling the vaccines. And I guess if there's one of the positives out of COVID is this understanding that we've produced a Pfizer vaccine that has to be held at -80 degrees, and how difficult it is and important it is to handle the vaccines. Well, the vaccines we produce do not tolerate freezing, and they do not tolerate sunlight, and they do not store for any length of time once they're out of a fridge. So it doesn't matter if you're vaccinating in the middle of winter, things are pretty good. There's not much sun on most days. The sun's not very intense. The temperature's usually not above 10 or 12. Everything's pretty good. But we're doing a lot of vaccination in spring and summer. We often get up early in the morning, put the vaccine in, head down to the yards, get the sheep or cattle in. Something happens, takes a little while longer, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you've got enough vaccine there for the day, so you don't need to go back to the main house and so on. And those vaccines can be sitting around for quite a while. So it's important that you encourage people to use eskies. It's very simple to have an esky with a cold brick in it. They work very well, keeps the sun out, and also put covers on vaccines when they're hanging them up and using them, as often happens in landmarking or those sort of situations. Basics is cold but not freezing, and scabby mouth used to be stored as a frozen vaccine. Some of you will remember that, but it's not. So we don't deal with any frozen vaccines at this stage. Avoid sunlight and particularly heat, long-term heat. Read the label to check on the exact storage conditions and also to vaccinate. Most vaccines are subcutaneous, but 1 or 2 have to be intramuscular. So you need to watch that. And attention to hygiene, and that's especially if you're storing containers. I do, as a producer, you can tell from my red hair, I'm slightly Scottish, and I hate throwing out vaccine. I get very annoyed that if the companies have only sold me what I think is 248 doses in a 250-dose pack. I'm that sort of person. And so I store the vaccine, but you need to be very careful if you're storing the vaccine that you've maintained a closed system, that you haven't got contamination when you've built it up, because believe it or not, well, you will believe it. Look at your cream cheese or any of your yogurts or any of your products in the fridge, in your fridge. Leave them untouched for a week or 2 and they've suddenly got mold or stuff on them despite being in the fridge. The fridge does not stop growth, it just slows it down. And so if you leave vaccine in there and it's already got contamination, a month or 2 later, it will have contaminants in there which could affect the health of the animals. So you've then got to throw it out. So I think I've laboured that point as much as you want me to. I've been asked to talk about the economics of vaccine, and it's really difficult. And I'm going to throw a bit of maths at you, which will probably send you right to sleep. Luckily, it's pre-lunch and not post-lunch. But I just want to make a few points about it. And there's no right or wrong answer here, so I'm not going to come out and say it's always profitable. But look, at current high prices, and I hate to say they're high prices, those of you who are optimists will say they're just average or low at the moment, but I think current prices are pretty high. If you've got animals that are at risk to a disease and you can vaccinate against it, you're almost always going to get your money back. The annoying thing about good disease prevention is you never know what a good job you've done. The difficulty of being a vet is you always get called out when a problem's occurred, not before it's occurred, and you could have predicted that it was going to occur. The fact that you could predict it was going to occur doesn't mean it was always going to occur, but it does mean that the person was at risk to it. So it's really a matter of trying to assess the risk. And if you are under risk and there is vaccine, it's pretty unusual that vaccine wouldn't be a cost-effective option. You'll have in your takeouts from today the fact sheets that I produced for MLA. I've put various scenarios in there. But as far as doing the economics of vaccination, but as far as economics go, it really depends on each individual farm situation and what they expect the losses to be. So it's a matter of assessing the likelihood and level of disease if you weren't vaccinated. And if there is any risk, then, as I say, vaccination is going to be probably worthwhile. So I'm just going to take you through. This is when people glean over. One of my kids in particular, if I put X up anywhere, I like using X. If I put X up anywhere, they tell me it's maths and they don't do maths on the weekends or when they're on the farm or when they're on the tractor or whatever other excuse they can come up with. So my apologies if this looks like a bit of maths, but my attempt here is to let you do your own maths, and it's pretty simple. So I've just done this with 100 animals because then we can multiply it by whatever number we've got. If we expect to lose X number of animals out of 100, and we expect a disease, rather than putting P in, I've actually put a figure in, we expect the probability of disease to occur once every 5 years or 0.2, and the vaccine costs a certain amount, Y, which is the cost of vaccinating those 100 animals, initially with 2 doses and then annually. So depending, again, it depends how long you're keeping the animals. But if you're keeping the animals for 5 years, that's 6 vaccinations over 5 years. So it's 1.2 or 1.15 times the cost of the vaccine, depending how you want to do it. So we just have to see whether that cost of the vaccination is greater than our losses. So for example, if a clostridial disease occurred 1 year in 5, probably pretty unlucky if a clostridial occurs 1 year in 5, and it kills 5% of animals. It would frequently kill more than that if it did occur, but if it kills 5% of animals, and I've done it for some sheep here, and they're worth $150, and you're going to say, well, they're actually worth $300, but some of them might only be worth $150. If they're worth $150, that's $750 worth of losses. Over that 5-year period, we'd expect to lose $150 every year. In any one year, we wouldn't lose anything, and then one year we'd lose $750. So we'd average $150 each year. How much does vaccination cost? If we're using 6-in-1, it was 32 cents a dose. It would cost us around about $40 a year. So you're easily going to get your money back. And you can imagine the cost of vaccine for cattle is almost the same, and cattle are worth 10 times the amount. So that's why I didn't do it for cattle. The numbers are absolutely ridiculous for cattle, how profitable it is. Now, you can do this for pink eye, you can do it for Campylobacter, you can do it for anything. And you can make the figures whatever you want them to be, whatever you think it is. But it's really up to what you assess the risk is. No one can tell you what you'd expect to, or what is going to be lost. You've just got to make some sort of sensible estimate from your experience and the sort of conditions the animals are being run under. So if we just have a quick look now at what sheep vaccines are available, and this list is available to you, so I'm not going to go through them all. Just point out that scabby mouth is a live vaccine. I'm guessing quite a few of you would use scabby mouth. It's zoonotic, so you do need to be careful when you're scratching yourself, and equally you need to be careful that you don't get disinfectant at landmarking into the vaccine. It's much better the way that the scratches are now done. There used to be open vials, and that was all a bit of a problem. I think that's probably the main one to point out there. The other one obviously is Gedare vaccine. I don't know how much is used over in Western Australia. It's quite dangerous if it's self-inoculated, and so we'd recommend a securitas or the secure vaccination system. It only requires 1 dose, and you really need to give that to animals at around 4 to 6 weeks of age, preferably. It says on the label up to 16 weeks of age. Animals pick up this disease at a very young age, and we think that if you get the vaccine almost at the same time as you pick it up, that the vaccine stops the disease taking. But the longer you leave that period, the bigger the risk you run that some animals get infected, and in that case, the vaccine doesn't have any effect. I haven't got, this was done in 2020, I haven't got Glan-Erie, which is the new combination, just to confuse us with now the cattle product, 7-in-1 product that Zoetis have brought out. That's the combination of Erivac and Glanvac 6. Glanvac 6. So that's the new combination vaccine. And I'm happy to talk about foot rot vaccines, but I don't think either you're allowed to use it or anyone use it there, but I'll take that in questions. The only one I really want to talk about is Campylobacter, and I'll mention that just as we come through here. So in terms of a sheep program, obviously at landmarking, and what I'm doing is putting up here not what you need to do in your program, what you need to consider. So at landmarking, you should be thinking about whether you should be giving 6-in-1, and I'd say for most people, yes. Scabby mouth, we can have a discussion around that. Gedare, probably not for many of you there, and plus or minus erysipelas. Yep. Thanks. 5 minutes. Sorry. Thanks, Ash. Right. And plus or minus erysipelas if you're worried about arthritis. At weaning, of all of those, at weaning, the 6-in-1 booster is important. You don't need a booster for scabby mouth. You don't need it for Gedare. And the erysipelas, you're probably through the risk factors, so you may not need that. Campylobacter is an interesting one. We did do some trial work here. The Kiwis claim that even in the absence of overt abortions, that they get a 9 to 10% improvement by using Campylobacter vaccine in landmarking percentage. We did trials, we found that in 1 in 6 places, and on 5 out of 6 places we didn't find it. If I was given the cost of everything, I would be looking at giving 2 doses to maiden sheep. That is the first time that they lamb. So whether that's you joining as lambs or whether you're joining as 1.5-year-olds, pre and post joining or both pre-joining is what's necessary for that. The 2 doses, obviously annual boosters are recommended, but in most cases, if you're getting an effect, we'd expect that there would be some natural boosting going on, and we rarely see Campylobacter in older animals. So I think that some sort of natural boosting is pretty good on there. Pre-lambing is also important, and I'll talk about that in the questions probably, but 6-in-1 and obviously pre-lambing to give protection to the lambs up until lamb marking, and erysipelas if you're worried about arthritis. I'll just make a note, most of the companies sell a lot of trace elements in the vaccines. Trace elements are required on a body weight basis. So for example, selenium is 0.1 milligram per kilogram. So a 10 kilogram animal needs half as much as a 20 kilogram animal. Vaccines, surprisingly, unrelated to body weight. You give a 1 ml dose to an 80 kilogram ewe or ram, and you give a 1 ml dose to an 8 kilogram lamb. So you need to be very careful if you're using vaccines to administer trace elements. They're only appropriate for lambs at lamb marking and not for anything else. And with purchased animals, if you know the vaccination status, well and good, but make sure you know it, don't assume it, or you can really get into trouble. We still see most of our problems around bought-in sheep and people just assuming they've been vaccinated and them not. I won't say anything about rams. They're so expensive at the moment. If you're not giving them a 6-in-1 every 6 months, I don't know why. Again, with the cattle, very similar story. I guess the pink eye is one that's there. Lepto, whether you give that all the time as a 7-in-1, or whether you give it specifically to heifers and not to the steers in a beef situation, you can have a discussion about that. We use a lot of BRD vaccines going into feedlots over here, and the others I've just included down the bottom for completeness. So just to look at the cattle program at calf marking, you're going to give either 5-in-1 or 7-in-1, depending when you're calving. Pink eye vaccine may be useful. I certainly use it in our situation. We yard wean about 4 months later. Pink eye lasts for about 5 months, so we're just on the outreach of that vaccine, but it seems to make a big difference. Post-calf marking, as opposed to weaning, the difference is that you're usually marking calves quite young these days. You're not weaning them for 6 or 7 months, potentially after you've marked them, or at least 3 to 4 months. You might have to bring them back in to give them that second booster because they are unprotected once you're 4 weeks post-marking for that 5-in-1 or 7-in-1. Pre-joining, either a lepto booster or pestivirus if that's an issue, and pre-calving, obviously 5-in-1 or 7-in-1 to protect the calves, and obviously calf scours if that's an issue. And again, bulls, clostridials at least every time they're in the yards. Vibrio vaccines, well worthwhile, very small cost, and I mentioned the BRD. So I think, Ash, that brings us back to my key messages, that vaccines are cheap and effective. Efficacy depends on challenge. We've talked about what the doses and we've talked about handling, very important. And it's really a matter of assessing what you need to use and then using that vaccine effectively. So I think I showed you this last year, but one of my kids wanted to post on Thank a Farmer. So luckily our sheep were very obliging, and we managed to get that photo. So that's it, Ash.
Bruce, thank you very much. We'll have some questions now. Yes, thank you.
When you're looking at something like coronavirus vaccine, when you rely on passive transfer, if you're vaccinating everything prior to the calving season, how does that protection sort of drop off throughout the season? does the quality of the colostrum dip towards the end, especially if you've got an extended calving?
Did you hear that, Bruce?
I missed the very first part.
Did you hear that, Bruce?
I missed the very first part of it. I got the bit about it dropping off at the end, and I can answer that. What were we specifically relating to?
Something like rotavirus corona, when you're looking at the rotavirus portion, does that protection drop off towards the end of the calving season?
So this is talking about using for a calf scours. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the protection doesn't drop off as calving progresses because the antibodies stay in the cow reasonably high, and they only go into the milk in the last 2 to 3 weeks of the milk's only made, the colostrum is only made in the last 4 to 5 days before calving. And so the calves get it. It only lasts in the calves by about 4 to 6 weeks. But the beauty with calf scours is most of those are in that period where colostrum is going to be effective. So that's why we don't recommend calf scours vaccines to calves at marking. They're already past their risk. Did that answer the question?
It's just because there's fairly strict protocol about how close to calving to administer the vaccines, say 6 weeks before or 5 weeks before. I was just wondering if you had a 3 or 4 month calving period, the amount of IGs you get in the colostrum, whether that drops off from the last calving cow compared to the first.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and I actually disagree. I was challenged on this the other day, and I am having trouble to find the scientific paper that I based it on, which I was shown from Morden Institute in Scotland in 1986. But this idea, and it's particularly relevant, I know you're asking about cattle, it's even more relevant in sheep. This idea that you've got to give these pre-calving, pre-lambing vaccines right on the point of calving and lambing is not likely to be factual. It's true that that's what they've done the research on. What the timing is important is if you don't get the second vaccine if you're doing calf scours for the first time, at least 2 weeks before the cow calves, at least 2 weeks before, it can't get in the colostrum, because it takes to mount the antibody response. That takes, remember, the first one takes 10 to 14 days. The second one, I said 3 to 7 days. So you've got to get that antibody response and the rise in titer. So what they're saying on the packets is make sure you're well before calving. But what I say to people, particularly about pre-lambing vaccination, is, and in a season like we're having over here, it's particularly relevant, is those levels that you get don't fall very rapidly, and it depends on what's in the blood as to what goes in the colostrum. If you vaccinate them 3 months before or 5 months before lambing, you're likely to get adequate colostral immunity for protection of the young for all those diseases. It is the risk on the packet is that you're too close to lambing, or calving, but everyone's interpreted the opposite way. I've got to wait until I get that close to calving. It's completely irrelevant. And in fact, the duration of calving, therefore, on those calf scours vaccine does not make any difference at all. Does that make sense now?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
It's a really important point, and I think it's misunderstood. And the reason it's misunderstood is there's no reason why the companies should go and repeat this work or do it, because they've already got registered products that we know work very well. But I'm confident that if the vaccine is given to pregnant animals early on in pregnancy, their blood levels will still have sufficient antibodies that'll be reflected in their colostrum. Maybe not 100% if you gave it on exactly that timing, but if you get it wrong and a couple of sheep or calves occur early, you've got no protection.
Bruce, a common discussion we have here is about whether to vaccinate for arthritis or not. Now, my understanding is the arthritis vaccine doesn't cover all strains of arthritis. Can you just give us some sort of insight into arthritis as a disease and the effectiveness broadly of vaccinating?
Yeah, I'd put a tick against that question, so that's the hardest question we ever get asked as well. Despite arthritis being a real headache, there's been only a small amount of work done, mostly of which been abattoir surveys. Bruce Farquharson and Joan, sorry, having a mental blank, Joan, anyway, I'll come to me in a minute, have both done some reviews. And erysipelas is not the only cause, and there are other causes. But what we find is that most people who are having problems with arthritis do have some erysipelas. So it does work. The real game changer with arthritis, probably get run out of the country for saying this, hope nobody from the DPI is there, but the real game changer around arthritis is the fact that you can't get, they put those animals on trucks anymore. Which means you can't get them on trans insurance, you can't get rid of them anyway. They're complete loss now, a lame animal, because you can't legally put them onto a truck. So that changes the economics of it, and means that realistically anything with arthritis is quite a loss on current prices. So my recommendation would be, if somebody has an arthritis problem, number one, get it investigated and see what the cause is. But even if they're not prepared to get it vaccinated, spend the money on one of the two arthritis erysipelas vaccines, and then see over 1 or 2 years whether that's making a difference or not. The point about the other ones is that apart from normal management, improving management, which you should be doing anyway, we don't have anything to stop it. So it is the only way you've got it. And you can't always, getting a diagnosis 1 year doesn't always mean that'll be the problem the next year. That's the real nut of the problem. Does that sort of address it a bit, Ashley?
Very well, thank you, Bruce.
Well, I don't know about whether you can see I struggle with that one.
Thank you, Bruce. Just got one question. Sinead?
On the...
Yeah, maybe come up. It's probably rather mean. Sorry, Sinead's coming up to the microphone, Bruce.
Thanks, Sinead.
Just on that, again, I've got a vet in my area that isn't recommending vaccinating for erysipelas. He is recommending giving a coverage of all your lambs with a penicillin or a alleamycin, to cover those strains that are not covered in the erysipelas vaccine. What are your thoughts?
If vet is recommending that on an individual property, I have no problems at all, because he or she has almost certainly diagnosed the problem and is concerned it's not covering vaccine. As far as that general comment going out to the public, I'd be 100% against that for two reasons. One is erysipelas is quite common, and so the vaccine can be quite useful, so dismissing it isn't necessarily appropriate. And the blanket use of antibiotics is something that the industry won't be able to carry on for a lot longer without coming under some sort of scrutiny. I've just thrown my hat on as the chair of the Sheep Sustainability Framework. I'm sorry about that. But there are sustainable issues around blanket treating with antibiotic, which I have recommended. So I'm not personally against it. And I'm not suggesting that I'm a Puritan in any of the sense, but we need to be aware of that. So on the strength of getting a vet involved on your farm is that they will look at your individual situation and give you the correct advice for your situation. I would not be making that as a blanket recommendation across a district, a state, or within a group. It is an option to consider, but I wouldn't be saying use blanket antibiotics to cover everything rather than using vaccination.
Thank you, Bruce. Just finally, we use a lot of 3-in-1 over here. I see you've recommended 6-in-1. Can you just explain that, please? Because, am I wrong? 3-in-1 is the most common vaccine that we use? Yes. Yeah. So 3-in-1 is the thing we use.
Yeah. 3-in-1 is great. I don't have an issue at all with that. I probably have an issue with rams, and I just that injuries and things. I mean, we don't live in a split nation yet. Prices of rams must be the same with you guys as we're paying for over here. Is that correct?
Oh, they're good value over here, Bruce.
They're good.
Yes,
So I'm going to come over
very
and buy some, will I? They just might die in transit on the way over if they've had 3 in 1 by the time I get them. That might be the problem. I mean, rams fighting and used pre-lambing or lambing with lambing injuries, that's what you're going to get more coverage from the 5 in 1 than, well, the 6 in 1 than the 3 in 1. So that's the big difference. But look, I guess the fact that 3 in 1 in your area, now I'm talking about the whole state, is the most broadly used vaccine says that that's doing its job, because people would soon change if it wasn't. I'm not here to say that I know something you guys don't. I'm the exact opposite. What I'm saying is have a look at your risk. And clearly, if you've been using 3 in 1 and it's been working, then why would you change? That's fine. The cost difference is 2/5 of nothing in actual fact over on our side. It might be slightly different on your side. The prices I've put in there come from the my local 2 stores of that green and red shirts that walk around. So that's how I've got my prices. Look, probably the biggest question I get on clostridial vaccines is I've given 1 dose to my lambs at lamb marking, and I haven't given a follow-up dose. I'm selling some of them, and I don't have any problems. So I think 1 vaccine works well. That works really well until you come a guts up at sort of 4 months post weaning. If you suddenly have a tight spring, the lambs don't get finished, you whack them into a feedlot and suddenly you lose a lot. So just be careful about that 1 vaccine, but I have no issue with 3 in 1. I think you'll see in my table I've got 5 in 1 or 6 in 1. I just didn't want to complicate the slide with putting every possible vaccine at every possible point on the slide. So it's a good point.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. That's a very good answer. Thank you. Just to clarify, what Bruce was talking about was pulpy kidney. When you put lambs unvaccinated into a feedlot, pulpy kidney is the big risk. Is that right, Bruce?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Bruce. Sterling job again. So we might see you next year. So all the best.
Please remember to go to the hospitality guys, but if it was, I'd like to be able to come over and say hello. That'd be great.
That'd be very good. Bruce, thank you for your time, and we'll show appreciation for Bruce, please.